Stop, death is a rendering error. The non-algorithmic wall. The monitor flatlined, but the room didn't go still. Tiny ripples of voltage kept drifting through tissue like fading weather. If death were a clean shutdown, nothing should move. But here's the thing. UBC Okanagan work argues there are hard limits to purely algorithmic descriptions of reality. If there's no master program, then delete is the wrong verb. Chicago's living patch heals by joining a field. Levin's Xenobots change goals by changing shape. And quantum biology keeps options open before it commits. So when biology crashes, what actually stops and what keeps echoing in the field? Hold that picture. Because this isn't mysticism, it's a rendering error we can measure. So let's name the subject up front. When I say you, I'm not pointing at a file on a hard drive. I'm pointing at a loop, a sovereign loop that your body keeps running across shape, fields, and tuned chemistry. Boundary, goal, defense under noise. That's the job your matter does every second. Cells signal with ions, tissues hold voltage maps, morphology sculpts what can happen next. You rides that stack like a surfer rides a wave. Change the wave, change the ride. But the rider isn't a line of code waiting to execute. The rider is the loop closing in matter. Here's the world we live in. We think digital first. If it exists, simulate it. If it breaks, reboot it. That metaphor has paid rent for decades. It built rockets and chip fabs. It models storms and market shocks. But you know what? It keeps missing the places life cheats neat boxes. Development doesn't ask for a central clock. Healing doesn't follow a script. Agency shows up in gradients and form, then shifts when the context shifts. Meanwhile, our stories about mind and death use software words. Upload, delete, shutdown. That don't fit how bodies compute. Now remember that UBC Okanagan framing lands like a sign on the road. Closed step-by-step algorithms may not give a complete, consistent account of reality. In plain speech, some truths are real but won't fall out of any finite instruction list. So if your model needs closure to delete a system, you've got a problem. A digital world can flip a bit and the avatar is gone. But in a field-first, continuous world, deletion isn't a button. It's a change in how patterns can hold together. Get this, the stakes sit in your pocket. Fear of oblivion, choices at the bedside, how hard to push machines when a body's loop is tearing, what to say to a kid asking where grandpa went. And it's not just grief. It's ethics for the tech we're building, organoids on meshes, living patches, hybrid sensors that heal. If identity is a defended pattern in matter, then respect isn't a speech. It's a boundary you can see and measure. So the central question, clean and sharp, can a non-algorithmic system be deleted? If U is a loop computed by fields and morphology in real time, is there a true off? Or only a phase change where one carrier fails and correlations drain into other layers, memories in other minds, field echoes in tissue, patterns in culture? That sounds abstract until you watch a planarian regrow its head guided by a voltage map. Or a Xenobot recollect purpose because the shape lets cells add up. Or that Chicago patch settle inflammation by being part of the body's own logic. Here's where it gets interesting. If life computes by being continuous, embodied, field-driven, then death might not be erasure. It might be a state transition where the organism-level sovereignty collapses, while information, correlations, obeys physics and persists. We're not waving hands. Conservation of information in physics isn't a Hallmark card. It's a guardrail that forced black hole paradoxes to evolve. The details are hard and still argued. But the baseline says, information doesn't disappear. So the right question becomes which information, at which scale, riding which scaffold, and for how long. Hold on though. Before we leap, we need a frame that connects lab bench to bedside. OSIM, sovereign inception in living matter, doesn't start with consciousness as a magic spark. It starts with three pillars: morphology as code, bioelectric governance, quantum adaptive engines. Shape writes behavior, fields hold plans. Scaffolds stabilize the weird just long enough to help. Stack them and you get a loop that sets a boundary and defends it. Sovereignty. That's the feeling of a basin of attraction with teeth. What nobody knew when we glued our hopes to code is how much the body carries by default. We keep finding that representation and mechanism aren't cleanly split. The state is the ledger. The field that stores a plan is the field that drives the act. And when you perturb it, the map rewrites on the fly. That's why deleting a file isn't an honest analogy. There isn't a separate drive to wipe. There's a landscape to flatten, or not. So the story we're about to tell moves like this. Peak moment. A body's field decoheres, the loop can't hold, monitors go quiet. Rewind. Why code hits a wall at reality's edge. Build. Living hybrids that heal by joining the field, bodies that discover new behaviors by changing shape, quantum engines that buy time and options. Crisis. What actually tears at death, boundary, narrative, carrier, and what physics says must persist. Resolution. Meaning after the wall, softer landings we can design, and honest falsifiers that could break this frame if we're wrong. Here's the human angle to keep in your hand. A daughter sits at the foot of a bed, gripping a warm ankle that won't stay warm. She's not asking for metaphors. She wants to know if this is a cliff or a shoreline, if endings can be shaped, if the story she tells about her father is all that's left, or if something in the way he held a goal in his body, the way his field coordinated pieces into a self, can echo. We won't promise comfort. We will follow evidence, name limits, and put testable claims on the table. To understand why deletion may be a category error for lifelike systems, we need to step up to the wall and see what it blocks. Then we'll walk around it with tools that compute with fields, not clocks. The non-algorithmic wall, why code fails at reality's edge. So step right up to the wall. At UBC Okanagan, Mir Faisal and colleagues took the clean digital dream and pressed it with hard math. The thrust is this. There are strong arguments, in the spirit of incompleteness and undecidability, that a closed, step-by-step algorithm can't deliver a complete and consistent account of reality. In plain speech, there are true things out there that no finite instruction list can produce from the inside. If your universe runs on a program, it inherits that ceiling. Some pieces won't fit, no matter how fast the hardware. Here's the thing. We built an empire on the opposite hunch, Turing machines, finite memory, discrete ticks. If we just scaled up, we'd swallow the world. But watch where it keeps slipping. Agency in bodies, context-sensitive growth, field-driven identities that hold a plan through noise. These aren't bugs you patch with more compute. They're signals you're using the wrong kind of tool. Let's break the wall in human terms. An algorithm is a recipe. Do this, then that, then check a condition, repeat. It lives on a clock and assumes crisp states, but some realities aren't best told as lists. They're better expressed as landscapes, fields, continuous dynamics where cause and effect braid across scales. If you try to serialize that braid, you shred the pattern right where it matters. Think of a wound closing. It is if tear then stitch. It's gradients of voltage and chemistry rippling through tissue, cell-cell talk across gap junctions, local forces aligning actin and flow. You can step it on a grid, sure, but the cost explodes when the edge cases bite. Sweat, stretch, infection, age. The discretization error becomes the whole show. UBC's wall isn't a vibe. It draws on the same incompleteness flavor that told mathematicians some statements can be true yet unprovable from within a given formal system. Translate that to physics, and you get a limit on what an algorithm, however fancy, can pin down as a closed description. That's the exact place where digital simulations start to plateau on open-ended lifelike tasks. You see marginal gains, ballooning costs, hidden fragility when context shifts. Now, why does that matter for death? Because deletion is an algorithm superpower. Flip a bit, garbage collect a pointer, and the avatar's gone. If your story of reality leans on that power, you think off is honest. But if the ground truth lives in continuous fields and embodied loops, deletion isn't a natural act. You don't unexist a field by asserting zero. You flatten a gradient. You tier governance. Correlations still have to go somewhere. What nobody knew when we worshipped code is how bodies compute by being. Look at Chicago's living patch for a minute. Not to repeat the details, but to name the type of computation. There's no master clock. The bacteria, the gel, The soft electrodes form a continuous circuit where state is both memory and actuator. The group's report in 2024 described active biointegrated living electronics that joined tissue-level signaling rather than just sampling it. That loop adapts because it closes in matter, not in a server. Try to write a for loop that heals when stretched. You'll discover you're just reinventing scaffolds and feedback in disguise. Or take Michael Levin's world at Tufts. The same cells, a new shape, and suddenly goal-directed behavior appears without a new script. Morphology is instruction. Bioelectric maps broadcast pattern-level intent. That's not a central controller. That's a field governing a swarm. You can model parts, but the emergent agency keeps dodging your stepwise net because it rides continuous couplings across scales. But wait, the wall isn't give up on math. It's pick the right math, field theory, dynamical systems, attractors and bifurcations. You describe basins, not bit strings. You ask how form preconditions flow so the next useful state is likely without specifying every path. That's a different discipline than writing exhaustive code. It's closer to architecture than to assembly language. Here's the stakes check. If your frame can't delete cleanly because the substrate doesn't snap to bits, then what dies can't be a pointer that got freed. It has to be properties that a loop needs to stay sovereign, a boundary that holds, a goal that binds parts, a narrative that integrates. Pull on those and the organism-level loop can fail. But the information that defined it, distributed correlations across field, form, and history, doesn't get burned. Physics won't let you torch it. It has to disperse, re-encode, or damp out on different substrates and timescales. Meanwhile, something else is happening across the hall. Quantum biology keeps showing that life samples options before it commits. Coherence buys time. Tunneling buys reach. Scaffolds tune the weird just long enough to matter, then hand off to ionic flows and tissue fields. That stack is allergic to hard ticks. It prefers rhythm, phase, and structure. So the wall blocks one route, totalizing stepwise description, and opens another. Build and think with the same primitives the body uses. Gradients, geometry, fields, growth. When you do, the category error around deletion snaps into view. You stop asking, where's the kill switch? And start asking, where does governance tear and what echoes persist? And here's the kicker. The most honest test of any frame is where it breaks. If deletion is easy and final, the transitions at the edge of life should be simple. They're not. You see delayed field signatures, residual reflexes, microdomains that keep negotiating for minutes under the crash. That's not superstition. That's a loop unwinding across scales, which means the right question after the wall is, can we erase? It's what can still carry the pattern when the main carrier fails. OSIM primer, sovereign inception in living matter. So let's lay the parts on the bench. OSIM starts with a simple move. Stop treating the body like hardware running code and treat it like a shaped, fielded, tuned machine that computes by being. 3 pillars hold it up: morphology as code, bioelectric governance, and quantum adaptive engines. And together they close the loop that gives a system sovereignty. First pillar, morphology as code. Shape isn't decoration, it writes behavior. You see it in embryos, in wound edges, in every organ's microarchitecture. Curvature channels flow, pores set who meets whom, fibers align forces and set delays. In Levin's work, changing a tissue's geometry with the same genome unlocks new competencies. That's because the structure preconditions the next move. It biases where contact happens, how cilia beat, how cells pack, and which pathways get reinforced. In plain terms, the body is a map that tells matter what it can do easily and what it must work for. Second pillar, bioelectric governance. Tissues don't coordinate by shouting chemical slogans alone. They whisper with voltage, resting potentials, ion gradients, gap junctions. Together they sketch a soft circuit that holds pattern-level intent. Make a finger here. Close this wound cleanly. These aren't slogans in a file. They're graded fields rolling across membranes and syncytia. Change the map and fate decisions flip. Not because you toggled a gene directly, but because the field changed the conditions genes read. memory lived here too. Stable voltage patterns can persist across turnover and guide growth back to a target after insult. Third pillar, quantum adaptive engines. Here, that's where it gets touchy, so keep it sober. Biology exploits coherence and tunneling at ambient conditions when scaffolds are tuned to hold them just long enough to matter. Photosynthetic complexes route energy efficiently by sampling paths in phase, then handing off to classical flows. Enzymes boost rates because protons and electrons take shortcuts through barriers aligned by protein flex and local fields. Spin chemistry likely sets a bird's compass, radical pair mechanism consistent with magnetoreception experiments in several species. None of this makes neurons quantum computers. It means the weird buys speed, sensitivity, and option sampling before the bioelectric layer decides. The Orch-OR hypothesis is an open proposal, not established fact. Our use here stays with verified quantum biological effects. Now stack them. Structure shapes flow. Flows and fields set local states. Local states reshape structure over time, growth, pruning, remodeling. That causal chain isn't a line, it's a loop. And when it closes tight enough, a system sets a boundary, holds a goal, and defends both against noise. That's sovereignty. You can feel it in how a planarian insists on a head, how skin knits, how a heart rhythm finds its groove after a stumble. The system doesn't need an external referee to call the play. The play is written in form and voltage, aided by quantum nudges that keep choices sharp. Here's the bridge to death without hand-waving. Identity in this frame isn't a ghost. It's the defended pattern of correlations riding that loop. The you that stays you day to day is the base and depth of your body's attractors, the integrity of your boundaries, the cohesion of your field-driven narrative across brain and tissue. When you learn, when you heal, when you choose, you're not executing a list. You're moving the basin, carving channels, deepening grooves that make some futures easy and others rare. That's why deleting a file metaphor rings false. There isn't a separate ledger. The ledger is the mechanism. Let me make it concrete with a micro story. A surgeon lifts a flap and feels a chill. The edge looks angry. Instead of blasting antibiotics alone, they place an ultra-soft mesh that speaks voltage, seeded with a native microbe community that eats the flare. The geometry slows shear. The embedded electrodes raise local hyperpolarization a notch. Over days, the bioelectric map drifts back toward a healthy tone. Cells migrate along channels the mesh created. The field is both memory and plan. The tissue reads it and acts. No server, no central clock, a sovereign loop nudged back into its basin. OSIM matters here because it gives us handles that aren't mystical. Want to steer a fate? Write a gentle gradient. Want a behavior? Sculpt the cavity. Want sensitivity without cryogenics? Tune a pocket so tunneling helps at room temperature. These are moves you can measure. Volts, ohms, coherence times, adhesion energies. And they're testable. If fields don't store actionable plans, your voltage paints won't yield anatomy-level outcomes. If shape isn't code, constant genomes won't flip competencies by geometry alone. If quantum engines don't confer advantage, muting those pathways won't change speed or sensitivity. But wait, there's a guardrail. Sovereignty in OSIM is bounded. Resources, geometry, and field coherence limit what a system can want and do. That's good news. It gives us levers and keeps growth under governance. You can cap replication with morphology, fence behavior with resource gates, tie competence to a host field so devices wind down when coherence fractures. Respect shows up as constraints, not slogans. So circle back to the question that brought us here. If U is this loop, structure to field to chemistry back to structure, then what happens when biology crashes? The answer won't be a bit flip. It'll be a tier in governance. Boundary fails, goals stop binding parts, narratives fragment, but the correlations that define you don't vanish in a puff. Physics demands they migrate, echo, or decay over time and place. OSIM names where to look, what to measure, and how to help the landing be softer when the main carrier can't hold. Case Evidence 1, Living Electronics That Heal, Chicago Patch. While that question hangs in the air, picture a bench in spring light. An ultra-soft oval sits on a petri dish, almost flimsy like damp skin. It doesn't blink LEDs, it breathes. Bacterial colonies, Staphylococcus epidermidis, the skin native you already carry, are woven into a hydrogel laced with whisper-thin conductors. No hard shell, no screws. The thing flexes when you breathe near it. Get this, the patch isn't attached to a body yet, but the way it equilibrates to room humidity tells you its job. It wants to belong. 3 doors open at once when they place it on inflamed skin. Stakes first. The tissue is hot, sour with cytokines, the kind of flare that spirals into chronic wounds. Pain lives here. Infection risk lives here. The patient can't wait for a clean model. What happens now matters, because if this works, deletion gets harder by design. When you try to knock it off balance, it pulls itself back. Action: the team eases the patch down. The hydrogel kisses microtopography, pores, hair stubs, tiny creases, and settles like a second epidermis. The bacteria don't sit idle. They read the chemical mood, flip metabolism, secrete calming metabolites. Meanwhile, the electrodes don't bark orders. They tint the voltage tone, a gentle push toward hyperpolarization that tissues read as cool it, reset. Ion channels in keratinocytes open and close. Gap junctions share the shift. Tiny ripples of membrane potential drift as a weather front, not a command. The device logs impedance and local pH, but here's the twist. The log is the mechanism. There's no gap between the state you measure and the state that steers the next move. Impact. Minutes in, redness softens at the rim. Edema recedes a hair. By hours, epithelial tongues creep under a safer chemical sky. By days, you can track a slow orbit back toward baseline in the voltage map. That's the signature of a loop reclaiming its basin. When the lab jabs with stress, stretch, sweat fouling agents, the patch doesn't freeze. Microtears recruit gel flow. The microbial community shifts roster. The electrodes keep listening and nudging. The whole thing acts like a small sovereign. Sense harm, enact care, preserve boundary. While that was happening on skin, something else was happening across their notebooks. The digital metaphor kept trying to sneak in. So what's the algorithm? A reviewer asked. The team grinned, because here's the thing, there isn't a discrete recipe running on a clock. The computation lives in continuous couplings. Metabolism changes ions, ions change voltage, voltage changes protein gates, gates change tissue state, tissue state changes metabolism. That braid is the program. It's self-documenting because the field you can measure is the plan the cells will follow if you keep it steady. Now zoom in on a micro story. A clinician, skeptical by training, tapes the patch to a stubborn shin ulcer. He's seen hundreds. Dressings fail, debridements fail. The patient winces when air touches it. 15 minutes later, the sting eases. He checks himself, placebo. That night he texts the lab a photo. The rim looks less angry. 2 days in, granulation tissue pebbles the center. He drops his coffee when he realizes he's not watching a gadget report data. He's watching a device join a living goal. But wait, where's the math? Right here. You can map resting potentials in millivolts. You can chart impedance spectra over time. You can quantify wound closure rates under perturbation. In trials, rigid sensors drifted under sweat films in motion. The living hybrid adapted. Perturbation batteries, temperature swings, stretch cycles, biofouling challenges showed graceful degradation with recovery, no external recalibration. That's not magic. That's a closed-loop computing in matter. Stakes again deeper. If state is ledger and lever, deletion doesn't look like a wipe. You need to crush the field geometry, starve the metabolism, and strip the shape that makes decisions add up. Instead, damage becomes part of the conversation. The patch heals micro cracks. New microbes slide into roles. The matrix swells and thins like a lung. You're not issuing discrete commands. You're writing boundary conditions the tissue can read. Here's the OSIM thread tightening. Morphology as code. The patch's softness and porosity keep junctions open and shear low, literally sculpting who talks to whom. Bioelectric governance. Embedded electrodes nudge tone, and the body answers in kind because voltage is a native tongue. Quantum adaptive engines. Keep it sober. The advantage shows up as sensitivity in enzyme networks inside the microbes and tissue, where tunneling can sharpen detection at room temperature. You don't need to prove microtubule mysticism to get clinical wins. You need scaffolds that hold fragile options long enough to tip a decision. Now the turning screw. The reviewer asks, what fails this? Good. If scrambling gap junctions or clamping potentials kills the effect, you've proved the field matters. If swapping the native microbe for a lab pet lowers resilience under fouling, you've proved morphology plus ecology rights behavior. If a rigid sticker with fancy firmware beats the living hybrid across months of sweat and stretch, OSIM loses ground. That's the right fight to pick. So what does this case tell us about death as a rendering error? Simple, uncomfortable, useful. Systems that compute by being are hard to delete cleanly. They degrade through governance tiers. They leave echoes, fields drifting, microloops closing late, memories in adjacent tissue states. The Chicago patch doesn't promise immortality. It proves a principle. When you join the field, the ledger lives in the body, and resilience is baked in. Which means when the big loop starts to fail, we should expect transitions, not switches, and look for places a gentle nudge can still help the story land. Case evidence 2, Xenobots and morphology as instruction. While the patch was teaching us to join a field, a dish of frog cells was about to flip the table on code first. So picture this. Technicians lift cells from the animal pole of a Xenopus levis embryo, the one slated to become skin, and set them free from their tadpole fate. No gene edits, no neurons added, just dissociated cells allowed to reaggregate, then hand-sculpted into tiny bodies with micro-tools. They called them Xenobots, Tufts University of Vermont team. Stakes first. If the same genome can express different competencies by changing shape alone, then identity rides structure, not just sequence. That matters for everything we think about self, repair, and the end of life. Because if form can unlock new goals, maybe function can recollect under new constraints when the old carrier fails. Action in simple media, these little clusters wake up. Cilia along their surfaces beat like oars. A sphere meanders, a football darts, a crescent with a mouth like notch scoops. There's no central controller, no hard-coded walk cycle. The tissue is competent. Adhesion, cilia beating, and local voltage cues do the coordination. Here, S where it gets interesting. Scatter loose frog cells in the dish like gravel, drop in certain Xenobot shapes, and watch. The C-shaped bodies don't just bump around. They herd the free cells into tight piles, like a tiny bulldozer circling sand. After a while, those piles compact, and with no new instructions, mature into new movers. Impact? That's kinematic self-replication, not mitosis, not budding. Motion plus morphology assembling progeny from parts in the environment. The team used an evolutionary search in Silico, University of Vermont, to explore forms that might stabilize gathering flows. The C-shape popped because the notch acts like a vortex cradle. Build that shape in real tissue and the effect appears. That's morphology writing the instruction by shaping contact probabilities, ciliary flow, and timing. Meanwhile, something else was happening across town in developmental labs. Bioelectric mapping kept showing that tissues hold a voltage language that guides identity. In Xenobots, that same layer likely keeps the body coherent under stress, coordinating cilia beating and adhesion. You don't need a brain to hold a goal. The field and the form can carry it. That's OSIM's heartbeat. Morphology as code, field as governor, competencies distributed. Stakes deepened. If shape can unlock replication-like behavior with a constant genome, then the program isn't a file. It's the body plan and its field couplings. That suggests identity is a basin in Morphospace, and certain shapes make that basin deep enough to pull in free parts. So what happens when body shape fails at death? Maybe pieces can briefly recollect, or loop echoes persist as local goals in surviving tissue. But wait, limits matter. The replication peters out after a few generations unless the environment stays primed with parts and the morphology remains tuned. Good. Sovereignty here is bounded by context, resources, and geometry. That boundedness is the safety rail we want in living tech, and it also describes how organisms fade. When parts energy and field coherence slip, the loop can't hold. The end looks like thinning, not a switch. Let's get concrete with a micro story. A grad student repeats the herding trial at 2 a.m. coffee cold. One C-shaped bot clogs with debris and stops. She trims the notch shallower. Next run the vortex holds better, the pile compacts faster. There's no line of code changed, just curvature. She writes in her notebook, shape decided. That's the sentence that lands like a bell. Here's the math you can touch. Curvature changes local shear. Shear changes cilia synchronization. Synchronized cilia set flow. Flow sets encounter rates for loose cells. Encounter rates set compaction probability. You can model each link, but the shortcut is the body. Build the shape, and the physics runs the search in parallel. That's why purely digital attempts drown in parameters. The wet runtime compresses the problem by exploiting structure. Now tie it back to death as rendering error. If self is a defended pattern that rides form and field, then collapse at the organism level is a loss of boundary and narrative integration, not a universal erase. The Xenobot result shows function re-emerging when the right geometry corrals competent parts. In humans, we're not going to sculpt post-mortem crescents in dishes to regrow people. That's not the point. The point is that basins exist. Some shapes and field tones make certain selves easier to hold. As the carrier fails, echoes of that governance can still bias outcomes. Tissue reflexes, residual waves, even how memories in other bodies crystallize. Falsifiers? Plenty. If changing morphology with a constant genome never unlocks new competencies across systems, morphology as code weakens. If voltage interventions don't shift behaviors in these constructs, field governance shrinks. If rigid micro-machines with tuned controllers can match Xenobot open-ended adaptation under perturbation, the advantage narrows. Those are honest tests. And the payoff if this holds. We stop treating forms as skins and start treating them as programs you can write with scalpels, gels, and fields. We build devices that carry goals by virtue of shape and voltage, then wind down when context breaks. And at the bedside, we learn to see endings as geometry and governance losing grip, then ask if we can smooth that slide with gentle field writing and form that helps parts say goodbye in order. Quantum biology, the engine that cheats the clock. While those frog bodies were corralling cells, another layer was doing quiet work under the hood. So zoom down past membranes and cilia into the weird. For years, people said quantum effects can't survive in warm, wet life. Too noisy, too messy. But plants refuse to play along. In certain photosynthetic complexes, energy doesn't stumble downhill like a drunk. It finds the best route fast with efficiencies that made physicists squint. Here's the thing. Hit those complexes with ultra-fast laser pulses and the readout isn't a simple decay. You see time domain wiggles like a beat, evidence of coherent excitation sampling multiple paths at once before handing off. Not a fridge, not a vacuum, roomish leaves. The protein scaffolds look tuned to cradle those states just long enough to matter, then release the energy with almost no waste. Structure shaping probability. That's the theme. Hold on, enzymes do a cousin of this. Classic models said many reactions should crawl if they waited for thermal bumps, yet rates soar. The explanation that fits data best is tunneling, protons and electrons slipping through barriers when proteins line up donors and acceptors just so. Change isotopes and the rates shift like quantum tells. Flex the pocket and the shortcut turns on or off. Again, scaffolds buying speed by inviting the weird for a blink. And birds. The magnetosynth story points to radical pairs, molecules whose spins start entangled, then evolve in fields as weak as Earth's. Tweak the field and you tweak reaction yields. Neurons get a different input. That's a compass that's chemistry, not iron filings. The point isn't magic, it's design. Biology found ways to stretch coherence and guide tunneling without cryogenics, only as long as it helps. Then it hands decisions to slower, sturdier layers. Now tie it back to the body's language. Ion channels are proteins with polar parts and movable gates. Tiny field shifts, local pH, scaffold flex, these nudge open probabilities. So you've got a stack. Coherence and tunneling at femto to picosecond scales bias electron and proton paths. Those biases change ionic flows through channels and pumps. Flows add up to tissue voltage maps across membranes and gap junctions. Voltage maps steer growth, healing, and fast behavior. Quantum sets the prelude. Bioelectric fields conduct the song. Get this? This stack explains life's knack for sampling options before it commits. Coherence keeps doors cracked across multiple routes. Tunneling opens a hidden hallway when the usual one jams. Protein structure sets the timer on both. When the field upstairs sees enough, it pushes the system into a useful state. That's why bodies look nimble under noise. They're not brute forcing millions of paths in a silicon sense. They're sculpted to hold options, then collapse toward a goal in rhythm with context. A human moment lands this. A plant biophysicist told me the first time she saw oscillations in her two-dimensional spectra, she blamed the instrument. She reran. Same beat. She changed solvents. The beat drifted like a living thing. It felt like eavesdropping on a quiet meeting between structure and chance. That's the vibe across labs now. Not mysticism, just careful setups revealing that biology leans into probability, then steers it with form. But wait, guardrails. Coherence times are short. Claims about neurons as quantum computers skate ahead of evidence. Keep it tight. What's solid is that specific proteins and complexes stretch the weird just long enough to improve routing, timing, or sensitivity. The benefits then flow up to ion currents and fields. It's leverage, not a silver bullet, and it's falsifiable. If you blunt tunneling pathways with targeted mutations and nothing changes at ambient conditions, the story weakens. If coherence signatures vanish under artifact controls, we rethink. So why does this matter for death as a rendering error? Because this engine resists crude off switches. When a body crashes, perfusion stops and ions drift. Fine. But down below, some scaffolds will still try to hand off on their decay schedule. Microdomains attempt one more clean transfer. Channels flicker as gradients flatten. Short-lived coherence won't save the whole, but it can seed residues in the field that linger seconds to minutes. Enough for delayed waves, brief reflex arcs, those late electrical size clinicians note without a story. That's a loop unwinding across scales, not a file closing. Now linked to OSIM's pillars. Quantum adaptive engines provide speed and sensitivity at the base. Bioelectric governance integrates those nudges into pattern-level intent. Morphology as code shapes both pockets, cavities, spacing, curvature. Stack them, and you get a machine that computes by being, not by stepping. Which means deletion isn't a key you press. It's the slow failure of structure to hold options and of fields to coordinate parts. Correlations bleed into heat, neighboring tissue states, and yes, other minds that carry your narrative. Here's the kicker. If we can tune scaffolds to invite the weird longer or right voltage to keep basins deep under stress, we can buy time at the edge. Not to deny endings, but to smooth them. Gentle field writing. Morphologies that keep boundaries kind as they thin. Devices that join the loop without grabbing the wheel. All testable, all measurable, and all born from seeing that life cheats the clock not by breaking physics, but by making physics choose well, fast, and together. Conservation of information. Why you don't just vanish. So here's the bridge we need to cross with care. Physics has a baseline most of us meet in freshman year and then forget when things get personal. Information doesn't just wink out. We learned it in the fight over black holes. Hawking's first pass said they eat information and radiate ignorance. That broke physics in half. Decades of pressure later, the field bent toward a different answer. The information's not destroyed. It's scrambled in correlations too fine to read. Devastating for your hard drive. Not deletion. Now translate that to bodies that compute by being. In OSIM terms, you isn't a file. You're a distribution of correlations across scales, phase relationships in brain and body fields, long-lived synaptic and tissue states, habits written into fascia and immune tone, narratives braided into other minds. While you're alive, sovereignty keeps those couplings tight enough to feel like one me. That's the basin. At death, the organism-level boundary fails and the tight coupling fragments. But the correlations don't go to zero, they disperse. Get this in plain terms. Energy is not information, organization is not energy. Burn a book, the heat goes up, but the poem's gone because the pattern is smeared into chaos. Physics still says the microstate encodes what was there, but good luck decoding ash. With living loops, you've got layers. Some patterns are fragile and local, phase-locked field rhythms across cortex and heart. Some are slower, connectome biases, tissue anisotropies, immune training. Some aren't in you alone. Memories carried by people you changed, skills you taught, voltage maps you helped write in a graft, morphologies you left in a lab library. So when biology fails, ask which layers can still carry pieces and for how long. The fast field coherence that stitches a single now across brain and body, those correlations drain in seconds to minutes as gradients flatten. That's where the felt self dims. But medium-scale patterns like structural biases in networks don't collapse instantly. They decay on their own clocks, hours to years, through remodeling and turnover. And the slowest layer, the social and cultural field, can hold echoes for generations. That's not mysticism. That's storage across substrates. Here's a human micro-story. An old carpenter dies. Weeks later, his daughter fixes a sticky door by shaving the hinge side. The trick he showed her with a laugh. Her hands remember a cut he taught her. That motor pattern isn't in his cortex anymore, but it's live in hers. It's a correlation he wrote into another body's field mechanism loop years ago. Physics didn't save his consciousness, but the information that mattered for that behavior survived in a different carrier and kept doing work. Meanwhile, something else lives between scales. Tissue you influence keeps its tone for a while. Transplanted cells, trained by your field, hold altered resting potentials and gap junction patterns until their new host rewrites them. Devices you helped build, living patches, morphology libraries, encode your design choices as shapes and voltages that bias outcomes. Those are literal patterns in matter that keep nudging futures long after your heart stops. But wait, doesn't conservation of information mean the whole you is in principle recoverable? Careful. In principle, the universe's microstate records every scatter unitary quantum evolution. In practice, macro patterns degrade when coherence fails and noise eats structure. The you that felt like you was a specific integration of correlations bound by a living boundary and powered by metabolism. That exact sovereignty doesn't jump carriers whole. What persists are slices, dispositions in other systems, records in matter and minds, statistical fingerprints in fields that relax. Here S where the wall helps again. Deletion is a digital verb. Life is analog in the deep sense. When the loop holds, it's because a narrow set of coordinated relationships makes certain futures likely. When the loop fails, those relationships widen, fray, and spread. The amplitude leaks into the world you altered. Some of that is soft stories. Some is hard, voltages, shapes, trained reflexes, tuned scaffolds. All of it is information that didn't vanish. It moved. And black holes, they taught us humility. If the nastiest eraser we know can't destroy information, a flat line in a warm room isn't going to nuke it either. It will scramble it across degrees of freedom you won't track. That's grief's bite. But it also means the honest picture of dying is a transition in how patterns can bind, not a metaphysical whole. Echoes are real. They're just not the same as sovereignty. So what's the use? Two things. First, ethics. If identity rides defended patterns, we owe respect to graded sovereignty while it holds, and to echoes we can see. That means treating endings as times to write gentle fields and stabilizing forms so the slide is kind and the fragments land where they help. Second, engineering. We can design carriers that preserve dignity, living meshes that calm chaos, morphology that holds boundaries just long enough for goodbyes, archives that log field maps as evidence of care. Hold the thought. If information persists in layers, the hard question becomes which slice feels like me. To answer that, we need to name what actually dies, boundary, narrative, and carrier, and where, if anywhere, the self can rebind. That's where we go next. What actually dies? Boundary, narrative, and carrier. So let's name the pieces clean. When a living loop fails, three things unravel on different clocks: boundary, narrative, and carrier. That's what dies, not as poetry, but as mechanics. Start with boundary. Sovereignty needs an envelope that holds ins and outs. Membranes, junctions, tight layers, perfusion keeping gradients sharp. Near the end, perfusion falters, ions drift, gap junctions misbehave. The voltage landscape that kept parts in one us thins. You see it in the body the way coastlines wash out in fog, edges blur, compartments leak, coordination stutters. That's boundary collapse. The self's perimeter stops biting, and outside starts to seep inside without negotiation. Now narrative. While the body holds, the field stitches moments into a single now. Brain to viscera, heart to cortex, a shared phase that lets a story run through you as one thread. You don't just recall events, you keep a spine through them. In the slide, this integration phrase first in pace, then in reach. Microstates still flicker, cells fire, channels open, but they don't phase lock across the whole. Memories lose their place, sensations stop gluing to a subject. The story chops. That's when people say, he isn't quite here, even while the chest rises. They're right. The plot is fragmenting, then halting. Then the carrier. The patterns that held you rode specific substrates, membranes with charges, networks with delays, tissues with anisotropy, a metabolism feeding it all. The carrier fails when structure can't keep basins deep and fields can't keep parts in time. It's not a button. It's a drift where scaffolds soften, channels uncouple, and the field can't pull scattered pieces into a whole. That's when organism-level sovereignty ends. The loop no longer defends a boundary or holds a goal as one. But here's where it gets interesting. Correlations don't drop to zero just because the main carrier can't hold. Pieces of your pattern ride other carriers you already touched. Some are local and fast, residual field echoes that ripple seconds to minutes as gradients flatten. Clinicians catch them as late waves, last reflex arcs, small negotiations after the flatline. Some are medium and structural, long-lived biases in tissue you train with your field. Immune tone that takes weeks to drift. Connectome motifs that remodel over months. Fascia's learned stiffness that eases slowly. And some are social, skills you planted in other nervous systems, habits you shaped in a family's mourning, voltage maps you helped write in a graft. They keep working on their own clocks. So what actually dies? The defended one, the enclosure that kept those correlations integrated as a single subject with stakes. Boundary collapse takes the crown first. Narrative decouples next, so the I can't gather itself. Carrier failure ends the ability to rebind. After that, information you were doesn't vanish. It spreads where physics already lets it live. Get this in a bedside moment. A son holds a cool hand and notices a twitch at the jaw 5 minutes after the monitor calls it. He flinches. The nurse says gently, it's just a reflex. True, but narrow. That's a loop echo. Local circuits discharging as fields relax. Not the whole returning. Not nothing either. It's the kind of residue a rendering leaves when the engine skips frames before settling. Ethics lives here. Graded sovereignty means we owe respect as long as boundary and narrative hold in any degree. We read field tone and behavior, not hope. We talk about goodbyes as writing the last gentle conditions the loop will know. Quiet the noise. Dim harsh lights. Keep familiar touch so the remaining coherence lands against something soft. It isn't theater. It's shaping a physical slide. Language needs care too. Passed away suggests motion. Gone suggests deletion. Neither hits the physics. Better to say the body's governance ended, the self's boundary dropped, the story stopped binding as one. What mattered in him moved into us, into the forms he built, into choices we'll make with his patterns in our hands. It's plain talk that doesn't sell magic, and it gives people a job, carry, tend, and aim those echoes well. Can me rebind? In this frame, not across a dead carrier as the same sovereignty. Rebinding means a boundary that can hold, a field that can integrate with stakes, and a scaffold tuned to invite coherence. That's new inception, not upload. Cells in a dish can discover selves when shape and field allow. We can help life become sovereign, but we don't bottle a finished self and pour it somewhere else. Falsifiers keep us honest. If boundary collapse weren't the primary failure, we'd see intact field integration with stopped hearts. We don't. If narrative didn't require global binding, late-stage coherent reports would persist. They fade as coupling fades. If carriers were irrelevant, patterns would jump intact. They don't. They smear across substrates and timescales. So the clean answer to what dies is narrow and heavy. The organism-level sovereignty, its boundary, its integrated now, its tuned carrier ends. The rest is physics doing what it always does. Keep information moving, let structure hold what it can, and let fields relax on their clocks. That's not a cliff. It's a shoreline at low tide, with ripples that still reach your feet. Falsifiers and hard tests put OSIM on the line. All right, gloves off. If OSIM is real, it has to win where metaphors die and numbers live. So we put it on the bench with predictions that can fail in public. Stakes first. If sovereignty is a loop in matter, then fields and forms aren't garnish. They're levers. If those levers don't move outcomes in controlled settings, this frame shrinks from engine to poetry. So here are 5 tests with teeth, each a story with a risk. Action Test 1. Living bioelectronic hybrids should beat rigid sensors under perturbation. Build 2 wound patches, one ultra-soft, breathable, seeded with native microbes and whisper electrodes, one rigid sticker with top-tier firmware. Run a perturbation gauntlet, heat swings, stretch cycles, sweat films, biofouling, unexpected chemicals. No cloud recalibration. OSIM says the living loop will degrade gracefully, self-correct, and preserve function. If the rigid control matches or beats it across hits, the join the field advantage wasn't real. Impact. Either we prove computation can close in matter and buy resilience, or we cut a pillar and rethink. Test 2. Morphology alone unlocks new competencies with the same genome. Hold lineage constant, say Xenopus skin cells. Sculpt bodies that differ only in curvature, cavities, and surface texture. Measure behaviors, herding efficiency, cargo handling, obstacle negotiation, onset of kinematic replication. OSIM says geometry writes instruction because it changes flows, contact rates, and field coherence. If behavior tracks only with added controllers or code, shape is code weakens. Impact. We either map Morphospace as a real program surface, or we stop claiming form does the heavy lift. Test 3. Stable, rewritable bioelectric memories guide regeneration specifics. Pick a regenerating model, planaria, axolotl, limb organoids. Map resting potentials pre-injury. Write targeted voltage patterns with ionic cocktails or microelectrode meshes. Read outcomes, corrected symmetry, orientation fixes, extra or missing structures. Track persistence through cell turnover. OSIM says fields store actionable plans as basins, not just transient tone. If writing voltage doesn't yield durable anatomy-level edits, bioelectric governance drops from governor to mood light. The impact here is clinical. Either voltage becomes a prescription, or we move on. Test 4. Quantum adaptive advantage at ambient conditions. Engineer 2 enzyme or pigment protein networks, one scaffold tuned for tunneling or coherent routing, one with mutations that blunt those modes but keep classical function. Embed them in soft conductors and measure speed, sensitivity, and noise robustness at room temperature. OSIM says the tuned network wins because structure invites the weird just long enough to matter. If both behave identically under noise, the quantum pillar needs a haircut. Impact. Either we keep banking on room temperature quantum assists, or we stop waving at them. Test 5. Algorithmic closure fails for open-ended agency at scale. Design a benchmark that shifts context mid-run, media viscosity changes, debris fields, geometry flips, mirroring Xenobot-style collection and assembly. Pit best-in-class digital sims and learned controllers against embodied wet systems with no top-down controller, just morphology and fields. OSIM predicts brittle generalization and exploding complexity on the digital side, while embodied loops adapt with bounded design effort. If digital generalizes cleanly without blow-up, the non-algorithmic wall feels lower than we claim. Impact. We either respect the wall as a real limit or treat it as a speed bump. Meanwhile, something else must happen in the lab notebook: pre-registered falsifiers. 3 bullets that would force us to retreat. 1. Living hybrids don't outperform rigid sensors under stress beyond what smarter code can do. Bioelectric governance sinks. 2. Shape tweaks with constant genomes can't create qualitatively new competencies. Morphology as code thins. 3. Rigorous artifact checks keep erasing ambient quantum contributions. No advantage left. Any two failing hard, we scale back claims. And what wins would clinch it? Replicable demonstrations that written tissue voltage maps set anatomy across species and persist through turnover. Scalable morphology libraries where geometry predicts competencies better than sequence alone. Direct links from scaffold design to extended coherent signatures or boosted tunneling yields inside functioning biohybrids. Plus one applied victory. A living device outperforming state-of-the-art silicon across messy months, with logs showing graceful recovery without cloud help. Here's the human moment. A trial nurse watches 2 patches ride the same sweaty shift. The rigid one drifts, flags check calibration. The living mesh keeps the wound quiet. She doesn't care about Orch-OR or Morphospace. She cares that the patient slept. That's the kind of win that buries arguments. Guardrails, we don't move goalposts. We publish head-to-heads, error bars, negative results. We log field maps and morphologies over time, state as audit trail. And we keep ethics in frame. Sovereign tech gets resource gates, morphology caps, and field dependencies, so competence stays local and wins down when coherence fractures. This is where we find out if death as rendering error is earned. If deletion's not a button, transitions should be measurable in residues, rebounds, and recoveries. These tests don't promise comfort. They promise clarity. Either the loop in matter is real enough to steer, or we stop saying it is. Death as rendering error, moment of collapse, field of continuity. So let's walk into the room at the exact second the loop slips. Perfusion drops, oxygen dips. The sodium-potassium pumps that kept tiny cliffs of charge across membranes slow. Ion gradients blur. Gap junctions, those little doors between cells, start misbehaving. In the cortex, synchronized rhythms that once locked distant regions into a single now drift out of tune. That's the biological crash, not a switch, a smear. And yet, hold on. You still see late waves, small twitches, field ripples that roll like aftershocks on a quieted shore. Stakes first, clean. If death were deletion, these residues wouldn't appear. But if the organism is a field-governed loop, then collapse is a tearing of governance. Boundaries soften, integration fails, but local circuits try to finish their sentences. That's why monitors sometimes catch a last slow surge after the flatline. Ion channels flicker as gradients relax. Microdomains discharge. The body's map gives up its shape in rings, not in a single blink. Action lands in 3 frames. In the brain, loss of perfusion triggers a spreading depolarization, a gray wave that marches across tissue as pumps stall. Neurons dump their charge, astrocytes swell, and the field that once tied regions into one time loses phase. In the heart, without fuel, coordinated conduction gutters. Pockets of excitable cells pop, then fade. In peripheral tissues, resting potentials drift toward zero. The weather of the body goes still, but not at once. It's an evening, not an eclipse. Meanwhile, something quiet is happening in the stack below. Proteins don't instantly forget their shapes. Scaffolded pockets still try one more handoff. Enzymes make one more improbable leap if the alignment holds. Those femto to picosecond attempts seed ionic blips that, added up across membranes, become residual field signatures. They don't restart a self. They are the echoes of a runtime letting go. Impact now. What does this change? First, it reframes the bedside. The late ripple isn't a ghost. It's a loop finishing under its own decay rules. That means gentle field writing still matters. Quiet the room's noise. Dim harsh light. Keep warm hands on skin. Simple moves that help remaining coherence die against something soft instead of static. Second, it hands us measures. If endings are governance tiers, you can map gradient collapse and field echoes in time. Millivolt drifts across scalp or tissue, impedance changes in organ beds, even micro-oscillations in peripheral nerves. Those are biomarkers of a rendering engine winding down, not of a soul leaving. You can set protocols, record voltage maps for 15 minutes after asystole to capture the area under the letting go curve. In living devices we deploy for palliative care, you log how a calming tone, slight hyperpolarization, soft rhythmic pressure, shortens turbulence and eases the slide. Boundary physics spelled out. As gradients flatten, diffusion wins. Electrical double layers at membranes lose teeth. The Debye length grows relative to meaningful features. Field lines that once hugged tissue architecture loosen. That's why coordination collapses from edges inward and hubs outward. It also explains the tiny lags that spook families. The jaw twitch, the foot jerk. They're not parting messages. They're residual couplings discharging on different geometries and time constants. Here, S where OSIM earns its name. If identity is the defended pattern, then a rendering error is exactly what we see. The scene is still on screen, but the engine can't draw new frames with global rules. Polygons misalign. Textures tear. Local tiles keep updating a beat longer, not because a director commands them, but because their buffers drain on their own clocks. It looks uncanny because our language expects a door slam. Biology gives us a fade with artifacts. Now turn that into practice. Palliative patterns field first. Build ultrasoft meshes that speak voltage in a hush. No sharp commands, just a bias toward calm. Lay them where autonomic chaos starts: neck, chest, palms. Let them raise local hyperpolarization a hair, lower noise in gap junction chatter, and dampen the wild little reentries that feel like internal earthquakes. Clinicians can watch in plain numbers. Fewer ectopic bursts, smoother impedance curves, a quicker, kinder settling. Gentle field writing extends to people in the room. A familiar voice reading slow, a rhythm of breath you can match. These are boundary conditions, not sentimental garnish. The last remaining integrators, brainstem circuits, heart field couplings, gut pacemakers, still listen to rhythm. Meet them with rhythm and they bind nicer for their final beats. Cliffhanger but honest. If we can shape the ending with pattern and field, how far can we go? Can we shorten the agonal storm without drugs by holding the map steady? Can we reduce the panic spikes that tear the last coherence? Can we leave tissues less chaotic so the immediate cellular aftermath, organ recovery, even research, arrives on a cleaner slate? These are testable moves, not prayers. One more human story to hold. A hospice nurse keeps a small, ultra-soft pad in her kit. No screen, just a mesh that warms and hums at a frequency she can barely feel. She tucks it against a sternum when breaths get ragged. The room stops bracing. 5 minutes later, the forehead smooths. The family notices the hands unclench. Nobody says miracle. They exhale. The nurse logs the trace, a shallow arc of field settling, a neat handwriting of an ending. This is death as a rendering error, a moment when global governance fails while local physics finishes its work. Not deletion, not deliverance. A field of continuity that thins, writes its last lines in small currents and shapes, and hands what's left to the world it helped make. Near death, memory echoes and field glitches. So let's walk right up to the part people whisper about: near-death experiences. We're keeping this grounded. No mysticism, no promises. Just physiology at the edge and fields under stress doing what fields do. Misbind, overbind, and sometimes integrate more than they should for a blink. Frame it clean. When perfusion fades and pumps stall, the brain's usual governance, phase-locked rhythms knitting cortex, thalamus, and brainstem slips. That's when the system sometimes throws a burst. Hypersynchrony can sweep networks that minutes earlier were balancing inhibition and drive. If you've seen EEG in crises, you've seen the brief spiking or the smooth, slow arcs that show everything trying to talk at once. Not healthy. But it can feel like clarity, because a lot of channels line up for a moment. Here's the thing, collapse removes guardrails. In a stable loop, thalamus gates, cortex vetoes, and memory writes selectively. As the loop wobbles, gating fails. Inputs bleed. Modules that don't usually handshake start to blend. People report tunnel vision, a bright center, a sense of being outside the body, a life review. You don't need magic to get that. You need hyperintegration across maps that usually stay in their lanes. Visual edges, vestibular cues, interoception, autobiographical memory, now folding into one big, loud mix. What nobody knew the first time they heard these stories is how much the body sets the stage. Retinal oxygen loss narrows fields, hence tunnels. The brainstem's last regular rhythms drive a steady breath-like oscillation felt as calm or a strange peace. Temporal lobe thresholds drop, stored scenes leak faster. Meanwhile, the bioelectric layer loses precision. Resting potentials drift, so local circuits fire together that wouldn't otherwise align. To a subject inside that storm, it can feel like more real than real because noise at one layer looks like coherence at another. Now memory. High salience events consolidate best when neuromodulators spike and networks synchronize. Near death, adrenaline is high, acetylcholine swings and chunks of cortex lock phases abnormally. That's a perfect, awful recipe for imprinting. It explains how thin slices of seconds can etch deep, even if the source was internal crosstalk more than clean perception. The life review. Autobiographical networks pulled wide open under a last blanket rhythm, with salience filters stuck on max. Field glitches also produce odd body maps. Out-of-body reports track with temporoparietal junctions losing alignment between visual and proprioceptive frames. In a slide, that misalignment is easy. Vestibular inputs lag, vision narrows, and the field that says, "This is me," can't bind. The system floats the camera because the anchor is gone. It's a rendering artifact of a loop dropping packets. So what do we test without crossing lines? Start with mapping fields near cardiac events. Not and only scalp EEG. Add impedance tomography, near-infrared for perfusion, and ultrasoft electrode meshes that can sit on skin without pain. Track in hospital arrests where monitoring is ethical and consented ahead of time. Look for the signature sequence. Spreading depolarization, hypersynchrony burst, then decay. Pair it with careful interviews later, when people recover, and see if report features line up with the dynamics. Tunnel with peripheral hypoxia markers. Presence with brainstem rhythm dominance. Life review with high coupling windows across default mode hubs. Closed-loop calming is the next move. No bright lights, no alarms blaring. Gentle field writing, small, steady hyperpolarization nudges on forehead and sternum, slow-paced breath cues. These are testable with existing non-invasive neuromodulation and bioelectric dressing tech. The goal isn't to steer content. It's to lower chaotic reentries so the slide is smoother. Measure distress reports, arrhythmic spikes, and time to quiet EEG. If OSIM is right, pattern and field matter enough that this changes the feel without drugs or with less of them. Ethics sits in every sentence here. Consent, privacy, respect for belief. We're not here to steal anyone's meaning. We're here to name the layer we can touch and measure. If someone says they saw light and love, we don't argue. We keep their report safe, and we do the science that might explain why brains under field collapse often converge on similar shapes. A micro-story to hold. An ICU team runs a new protocol. During a code, a nurse dims monitors visible to the patient, cues a low metronome, and places an ultrasoft pad on the sternum. Later, the patient describes a tunnel, a calm wave, and a sensation of being held. He doesn't care about voltage. He cares that the fear was smaller. The trace shows a shorter hypersynchrony arc before settling. It's not proof of anything beyond this. Even at the edge, boundary conditions talk. Here's the last point. These episodes aren't evidence of uploads or guarantees. They're evidence that when governance tears, integration can spike in strange ways, memory can etch strong, and fields can misbind maps that feel like more world, not less. If we respect that, and we can measure it, we can make endings kinder and keep our claims honest. Meaning after the wall, sovereignty, grief, and design. So here's where it lands after the wall. If deletion isn't the rule, then meaning isn't a score we lose at the buzzer. Meaning is a defended pattern, held by a boundary, guided by a field, written into form. When sovereignty fades, that pattern stops holding as one, but parts of it keep working where they can. That changes how we live, how we grieve, and what we build. Start with sovereignty as a daily craft. You deepen your basin by what you practice, sleep that keeps fields coherent, food and movement that tune scaffolds, friends who help your narrative hold when your own map wobbles, skills that etch into other bodies, care you hand to kids, neighbors, patience. All of that is you thickening the structure where you rides, not a file, a set of grooves in matter and minds that's harder to knock loose. Grief looks different through that lens. The punch is real, the one stopped being one. But the idea that everything that mattered is gone is a trick of language. Echoes exist in hard places, gestures that live in our hands, roots through a room we still take, rhythms a house keeps for months. They exist in soft places, phrases we can't help using, reflex kindness we learned by watching. You're not required to feel better because physics says patterns persist. You're allowed to feel less alone because the world you're standing in is still playing what they wrote. Rituals make sense now. They're not just culture, they're field writing. The room changes tone. We dim lights to ease last coherence. We sit close to borrow stability. We tell stories to pin memory to a rhythm so it lands and doesn't scatter. We handle the body with steady hands because touch still speaks to the last small integrators. We pick a place to visit because spaces hold patterns, angles, sounds, smells that keep echoes from thinning too fast. That's design, not superstition. Design ethics shifts too. If sovereignty is real and graded, then living tech has to respect it. We don't bolt gadgets onto bodies and demand obedience. We grow meshes that join a field and wind down when the host coherence fractures. We add resource gates and morphology caps so nothing overruns a niche. We log voltage maps the way we log vitals, with consent and care, because state is both memory and plan, and that's intimate. We write policy that audits sovereignty. Does this device defend the host's boundary? Does it hold a goal aligned with tissue health? Does it stop when the map breaks? Get this? The same rules guide cities and classrooms. You can push commands down a pipe, or you can set boundary conditions that let good loops find themselves. Street curves that slow cars without tickets. Schedules that protect sleep for kids so their fields can bind. Community kitchens where skills re-encode across generations. Meaning shows up where sovereignty can breathe. A micro story. A hospice team meets on a Tuesday. They've started carrying two new things, an ultrasoft field pad and a memory basket with slips of paper and pencils. When a patient is close, someone sets the pad at the sternum, breathes slow with the room, and asks each visitor to write one small body memory. How she folded towels, the song she hummed when the kettle clicked. The pad smooths the slide. The basket seeds echoes that will keep cooking in other kitchens. The team doesn't say metaphysics. They watch families relax. They read thank you notes months later that talk about a house that still feels like her, and a granddaughter who now hums that song. Personal stakes. Live like a gardener. Choose habits that keep your field clear, walks, friends, quiet work. Teach someone your best moves long before you think they'll need them. Label tools in a way a stranger could use. Leave morphology libraries, not just journals. Forms that work, voltage tones that help, scaffolds that anyone can grow. Make your basin deep and wide so when it thins, it spills into places that matter. And when endings come close, ask the practical questions. What boundary can we still hold? What field can we still calm? What form can we still shape so the last pages aren't torn? That's care you can feel. That's meaning you can measure. Here's the design mandate after the wall. Build for soft landings. Devices that join, not boss. Clinics that write patterns, not just prescriptions. Homes that carry echoes well. Schools that teach kids how to hold a boundary with kindness. Labs that publish head-to-heads, not hype, and share state logs so we can learn the craft together. Because if death is a rendering error, our job isn't to beat the engine. It's to steady the scene, carry the echoes, and design for lives that bind well while they're here, and let go clean when they're done. Engineering soft landings, cultivation over control. So here's the build sheet for endings that don't shatter. We stop aiming to command a shutdown and start cultivating conditions so the loop can settle. Gentle field writing, morphology that cushions, hybrids that join and then wind down. Cultivation over control. Clinically, the move is simple and hard. You map the tone of the room the body still hears, light, rhythm, touch, and the tiny voltages on skin. You add an ultrasoft mesh at the sternum or along the neck that speaks voltage in a hush. A small, steady hyperpolarization bias that quiets chaotic reentries, not brute force, boundary conditions. The pad is breathable and flexible so gap junctions keep talking without shear. Its electrodes are sparse and low current. You're not running a program. You're steadying a field. You pair that with morphology that literally shapes the slide. Pillows that keep a chin neutral to ease airway reflexes. Weighted blankets light enough not to fight breath, heavy enough to stabilize proprioceptive loops. A soft cuff at the wrist that slows sudden extension. These aren't comfort props, they're geometry that dampens runaway cycles. Add a paced breath cue at 5 or 6 per minute audio or a tiny haptic metronome. Brainstem circuits still listen to rhythm. Meet them with rhythm. Now add the living partner, a skin-native microbe mesh, the cousin of that Chicago patch seated in an ultra-soft hydrogel band. It feeds on the stress chemistry the skin throws and secretes calm. It also carries whisper-thin conductors that log impedance and deliver the gentlest nudge. You see fewer premature beats, smoother impedance curves. Families don't need to know volts, they feel the room settle. When coherence breaks fully, the band's goal ends by design. It stops acting, not because a cloud told it to, but because its resource gates and field dependencies say, no host, no work. Research makes this honest. We run trials in palliative care with consent, randomize rooms to full pattern care, dim blue light, paced breath cues, ultrasoft voltage pads, morphology supports, and living meshes versus standard of care. Primary outcomes: reported distress, agonal storm duration, sedative load. Secondary: field traces, scalp and chest microvolt drifts, impedance curves, peripheral nerve oscillations. OSIM predicts smoother slides, fewer spikes, less drug. If the data don't move, we change the levers or retire them. Devices get guardrails, sovereignty audits on every design. Does it defend the host boundary? Does it hold a goal aligned with calm? Does it wind down when coherence fractures? We bake in caps. Resource gates so replication can't run. Shape-dependent kills that collapse function when geometry leaves the niche. Field dependencies that cut competence without a host tone. No remote override theatrics. The body is the governor. Labs build morphology libraries for resilience. Catalog shapes that steady flow in lungs, curves that keep swallow safe, pads that reduce startle. Pair each with voltage tones that help the remaining integrators bind kindly. Share designs open, with state logs, not just outcomes. An atlas of soft landings grows, forms and fields that different bodies respond to under stress, from ICU chaos to home hospice quiet. Society has work too. Policy that treats living devices as partners, not gadgets. Certification that measures perturbation resilience and boundary respect, not just one-number performance. Data rules that treat field maps like vitals, private by default, shared only with consent, stored as care, not as product. Hospitals shift from beeping temples to pattern-aware spaces. Fewer alarms, more rhythm. Light that respects circadian fields. Rooms that absorb harsh echoes. Endings shaped by design, not ignored by noise. Culture can learn the craft, teach fields and forms alongside first aid. Community kits with a small, safe voltage pad, a breath metronome and soft supports. Families practicing a calm setup long before they need it. Gardens over gadgets, spaces where shape and rhythm do the first round of care. Kids learning how to hold a boundary in bodies and in rooms so panic doesn't set the rules. And yes, research on ambient quantum assists has a role, not in brains as qubits, but in enzyme networks embedded in pads that sense tiny biochemical shifts and tune voltage nudges in real time, consistent with known tunneling-enhanced catalysis and room temperature excitonics. Scaffold-tuned pockets that keep sensitivity high at room temperature, so help arrives before storms. Falsifiable, measured, sober. Here's the micro-story that sticks. A daughter sits with her mother. The nurse lays a warm, ultra-soft pad at the sternum, dims the blue, and starts a slow breath tone. A small mesh on the forearm hums almost below touch. The jaw tremors ease, the hands unclench. No one whispers miracle. The room breathes with the loop that's letting go. Later, the trace shows a clean arc of settling, fewer spikes, less fight. The daughter says she felt held. That's the bar. We end control fantasies. We cultivate exits. We build devices and rooms that speak the body's language, then stand back. Field, form, and tuned chemistry do the last careful work. What changes if death isn't deletion? If ending isn't a wipe, then life is the art of shaping patterns that can land softly and echo well. You deepen your basin, teach your moves, and design rooms that help the last frames render clean. If you want more of these field-first builds, subscribe and stick around. Share this with one person who needs steadier language for endings. Drop your toughest falsifier below. We'll take it to a lab, run the head-to-heads, and publish the logs. And if you caught a missed source or year, call it out. We'll correct it in the pinned comment.